Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. Okay, let's take a brief look at the book of Romans. You may or may not know that this book has probably been the subject of more scholarly writing and discussion and debate than any other book in the Bible in the last 100 years or so. There is just no end to the commentaries and articles and papers and PhD dissertations and every other kind of writing and discussion of the book of Romans. So the chance of me being able to comprehend that, never mind compress any of it much usefully into 10 minutes, that's always the aim of these little devotions, is practically zero. So let me tell you what I'm planning to do with this letter. First, I want to give a very, very super simple overview of it, which will be far too simple for any of you guys out there who may have done any reading or any serious study of the book in the past. For the first minute or so after this introduction, you'll be thinking, yeah, this is obvious and it's too simplistic. Then what I want to do is to take a couple of steps beyond that and indicate some of the more technical or debated or confusing issues which will probably be too complicated for any folks looking at this letter for the first or even the second or third time, but may stoke the interest and inquisitiveness of some of you guys who've been reading this letter a little bit more. So hopefully there'll be a little bit of something for everybody, something for people who are coming to this not quite for the first time but wanting to get a handle on it, and also for folks who are wanting to get into the book of Romans in a bit more detail, because it really, really does repay serious study. Here is one book of the Bible that there's no end to the riches in the scriptures, but the book of Romans exemplifies that wonderfully. So here's a really, really simple outline. In chapter 1, after a brief introduction expressing his desire to visit the Christians in Rome, Paul the Apostle begins by articulating the reason why the wrath of God is being poured out upon all humanity. And the reason is because of the sinfulness of all humanity. The theme of human sin pervades chapter 1, chapter 2, and the first half of chapter 3. Before we get to the climactic statement in chapter 3, verse 20, by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. Then we get the first massive transition in the letter. In chapter 3, verse 21, but now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. This begins God's solution to the problem of sin, which is articulated in the first 3 chapters or so. And this continues for the next few chapters. In chapter 4, Paul explores in a bit more detail the doctrine of justification by faith, that faith by which we're united with Christ and declared righteous or justified. Chapter 5 is dominated by an exploration of the parallel between Adam, in whom all sinned and all die, and Christ, in whom those who have faith are made alive. Chapter 6 explores how the death of Christ gives us liberation from indwelling and besetting sin. Chapter 7 touches on the relationship between the Christian believer and the law of God. And chapter 8 expresses the hope for our future glory in the context of the suffering of the present age. We then get to chapters 9 to 11, in which Paul explores the troubling and perplexing question of what about the fate of the Jewish people of God, the Old Covenant people, to whom the promises seem to have been directed in the Old Testament, but who have not, in the main, accepted their Messiah. What are we supposed to think, Paul asks, about their apparent rejection of the Messiah whom God their Father sent to save them? That's chapters 9 to 11. And then chapters 12 to 16, you've got a transition, because here, as sometimes you see in Paul's letters, you see the same pattern in Ephesians and Colossians. The second major part of the letter, the second half of the letter really, explores the practical implications of the gospel which Paul has just outlined in the first half. So that is a wholly inadequate Very superficial really, but hopefully enough to get you into the letter if you're not so familiar with it, to get into it for the first time, start exploring some of its riches. Now, what about you guys who've read this a little bit more? Let me change tack and suggest a few things that you might want to dig around in if you have read the book of Romans a few times and you're kind of excited about it and you want to dig in and try and explore some of these, the more scholarly debates and questions. First up, you should look at the first 6 verses, really compressed introduction. I encourage you to read something on that, read Cranfield's commentary or read some stuff by Tom Wright or by Tom Schreiner. They'll give different perspectives. You won't agree with all of them. You couldn't possibly agree with all of them, but they're all interesting to read on the introduction. Chapter 1 verses 16 and 17, you should dig into that and particularly try and explore the background of the quote in Habakkuk chapter 2 and try and figure out what's the relationship between the context of Habakkuk with the invasion of the Babylonians and the righteous living by faith there, and the righteous living by faith in Romans 1. That'll keep you busy for a while. Chapter 2, you might want to think about the old chestnut question of the identity of the people whom Paul is talking about, who are the doers of the law who will be justified. Is this a hypothetical category, as some have thought, that because there's nobody who can do the law and therefore nobody who can be justified in that way? Is it talking about Gentile Christians, as for example Tom Wright has argued? Is it talking, as some have suggested more recently, and I think perhaps some in the past have, about people who are outside the old covenant between God and Israel, but nonetheless were righteous in the sense that, for example, Naaman or Jethro were righteous? Is that the kind of person that it's talking about? You might want to explore that question a little bit. Chapter 3, verses 21 to 31, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you'd find enjoyable to read on that. Again, I mentioned Tom Wright already. It'd be good to read him, read Cranfield, read Tom Schreiner. Those guys are my 3 favourite guides to Romans, but there's a whole pile of interesting stuff on those verses, and those are important verses, so it'll be interesting to dig into those a little bit. You will want to look at chapter 5, especially the second half of chapter 5, and really explore in detail this parallel between Christ and Adam. This opens up the doctrine of original sin, which will also keep you occupied thinking that those issues through for a while. Just notice, while I'm on the subject of chapter 5, there's a break in the in Paul's presentation at the end of verse 12, and he picks it up again in verse 18, and I'll show that to you. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Therefore, just as, you're expecting a therefore, so also, to complement the just as. Well, the so also doesn't come until verse 18. Therefore, as one trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all men. So that's just a little structural hint to this. If you want more on that, John Murray's book on original sin is really good. Chapter 6, you want to think about the relationship between baptism and the death of Christ and our renewal and transformation in him. Romans 6 attributes astonishing efficacy to baptism, and it's really worth thinking through that. You want to think about the identity of the so-called wretched man in Romans chapter 7, the man whom Paul seems to describe as though it's he himself. Is it Paul before he was a Christian? Is it Paul the Christian? Is it everybody before we were Christians? Is it everybody as a Christian, everyone who is a Christian? Is it a salvation historic perspective where the I is Israel personified, or is it some combination of those? That'd be worth thinking about. Romans 9 to 11, oh goodness gracious, we really could get lost in there. One question that you might want to think about here is the question that arises at the end of chapter 11, when Paul remarks that all Israel will be saved in chapter 11 verse 26, and then he quotes from Isaiah 59, or in what way will all Israel be saved? Paul actually says, in this way all Israel will be saved, and that's where the quote from Isaiah comes in. So how exactly will all Israel be saved? Does this envisage, as many of the Puritans thought, a great future ingathering of ethnic Israelites from all across the world? Or does it envisage, as I'm inclined to think on the basis of the quote from Isaiah, therefore I gave you a little hint there of what I really think, but you might want to investigate this for yourself, that the all Israel being saved is a reference to all of the Israel that's in view in the quote from Isaiah, which seems to me to be people from every nation, at least in the next few verses in chapter 60. So that's something else to think about. Very quickly, other things in the second great chunk of the letter, chapter 13, you want to think about the place of civil authorities. That'll keep you occupied for a while. The application of chapters 14 and 15, the weaker brother chapters, you want to think about the practical implications of that. And interestingly, in chapter 15, again, you've got all the sacrificial language which is applied to Paul's ministry and the life of believers in the second half of the chapter. That's interesting to think about too. So that should give you plenty of stuff to think about, whether you're just starting out with the book of Romans, just trying to get into it for the first time, or whether you've been reading it for 20, 30, 40 years and you want to dig a little bit deeper and explore some of those other questions. Hope that's been helpful. The Lord bless you, and I hope very much to see you soon. Bye for now.